Okay, we're recording. So hello everyone. My name is E. Patrick Johnson. I'm the Dean of the School of Communication and a professor in African American Studies and Performance Studies at Northwestern University.
And I'm John Jackson. I'm Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And along with Patrick, one of the filmmakers behind Making Sweet Tea, The Lives and Loves of Southern Black Gay Men. And we thought we'd spend some time kind of talking to one another about the film, both the process of making the film, but even maybe some of what brought us to the idea of doing a project like this together to begin with. And it should be fun, I think, to talk about it. It was definitely fun to make.
Yes.
And so I thought I would start by asking you, so let's put the film to the side for now. And let's talk about your approach to doing research. Because in some ways, I think, for me, the interest in making the film came out of my interest in your approach as a methodologist to doing research. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about kind of how you do research, what you brought to that process that predates your life in the academy, then how that translated maybe into the first iteration of this project, which was the book.
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because one of the things that I think is really that gets blurry for me methodologically is this an oral history or is it an ethnography? And I think the answer to that question is that it's a little of both. It started out as an oral history project, me wanting to sit down and get the oral history narratives of Black gay men who were born and raised in the South. But because a lot of my background is in ethnographic methods, particularly performance ethnography, I've always been interested in the sort of political economy and the cultural context in which people are actually narrating their stories. So it's not the typical kind of oral history in the sense that it's a one-off where I go and spend an hour or two with someone and that's it. In all the interviews that I did, I spent time in their neighborhood, in their city, in their community for a little while, and sometimes going back to the places where they lived to provide a broader context for the story that they were actually telling. The other thing is the narratives are not edited in the same way that traditional oral historians would edit narratives. And it's always been a really interesting tension for me as someone invested in performance to have to edit out some of the very things for me that makes oral history so dynamic, and that is the way people speak, whether that is their dialect or the nonverbals that come along with those. But in traditional oral history, the paradox is many oral historians will edit a narrative such that it looks more like written speech or the written word, as opposed to orality or the way people actually speak. So the ums, the uhs, the ticks, and all of those things. And sometimes the narrative itself is written in a way that goes against the way we really talk. Like what I just did there, where I stopped, I paused, I'm thinking. In traditional oral histories, if you think of someone, for instance, like Studs Terkel, it's a very, contained, heavily edited piece of work. Whereas I'm actually interested in those pauses. So it's more of a phenomenological approach. What's going on in the moment of the act of storytelling, um, in addition to the content of what it's saying. So that's why it gets kind of blurry uh, when I think about my method, because it's sort of a combination of qualitative interviews, which is common among ethnographers, but also they are oral histories in the sense that they are delivered orally in a particular time and space, but it's also ethnographic in that I'm taking in the cultural context. So it's a lot going on, and it's also a lot to attend to. So then the form in which that research is presented becomes all the more important. And this sort of is leading up to all the iterations that this research has uh, been presented in. So the book, for instance, um, was an interesting process in that when I when I had the original draft, it was over 1,000 pages. And the University of North Carolina Press laughed at me. My editor was like, we're not publishing a 1,000-page book. And I sort of knew they weren't, but I was going to try my best. And it still ends up being a 600-page book. But the interesting thing is that even in the title, it became a methodological, disciplinary conundrum, because the original title was Sweet Tea and oral history of Black gay men in the South. And someone at the press took exception with the use of oral history for the very things that I just discussed. They weren't heavily edited. I included the interview questions that I asked of the men in the actual presentation of the work. Is, oh my God, that's unheard of. You don't do that. You are supposed to be unseen as the interviewer. Um, and this as well, John, as ethnographers, we have long since dispensed of the whole notion of the invisible, ethnographer. So it went against the grain of everything that I believe in. So we had this struggle, even with the title, because oral history was not, they didn't think of this as a traditional oral history, and it isn't. But again, so the compromise was Sweet Tea Black gay men of the South dash and oral history. So that was the compromise. But that again, that goes to my very point about how people are um, sort of I don't want to say stuck, but committed to these, very rigid disciplinary methodologies, where I often describe myself as an academic trickster, in that, I don't like being pinned down in any way, because I think the form that the research takes is the one that it wants to be in the world at a particular given time. And so that's how the book came about. Um, and we can talk about then how it moved from a book to the performance, if you want.
I, one of the, I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons, and this is my own methodological bias, I guess I'll admit. One of the reasons why I think about your, at least Sweet Tea, the book, being such an incredibly important starting off point for this conversation is precisely because it's one of these texts that doesn't allow itself to be policed by methodologists in that traditional way, right? So there's the same kinds of debates obviously going on between and among ethnographers, right? Like what counts as legitimate ethnography, right? How you render it. They're all, and we're constantly trying to figure out how to enter into these conversations in productive ways and what parts of these approaches and genres work best for the kinds of stories we want to tell. And for me, what jumped out about the Sweet Tea book that felt, this isn't fair to oral history because I know this isn't an accurate way to describe the difference between the two, but it just felt so holistic and comprehensive. And to me, that's one of the hallmarks of the ethnographic sensibility, right? The ethnographic, which is to say, like, we're going to really try to paint a picture that is nuanced, that allows us to see all the connective tissue between and among the topic and subject. And there's a version of, if anyone's seen the book, it is a big book, right? You talked about the 600 pages. Tell us a little bit about how you structured the book. Like what would because one of the difficult things as an ethnographer, and I struggle with this all the time with each ethnographic project, is how do you actually take the data you imagine you accumulated and put it together in a narrative that feels like it works in some way that imparts to the reader what you think they need to know. And I know you took a lot of time trying to figure out the best way to formulate, organize this material. So tell us a little bit about that, because I do think we can see whether or not we track some of that maybe in the subsequent iterations once it leaves the page too,
Yeah. So I think that one of the challenges with having such a big volume of work is just that, how do you tell a story? And, we can talk about this later about the same with film, when you have 80 hours of footage. So I had close to 4,000 pages of interview data that I had to figure out how to cull together in a way that made sense, that felt, you're never going to tell the entire story, the whole story, but how to cull that research in a way that at least made an attempt at giving us a nugget of the breadth that is the South, the breadth that is Black gay men. So one of the things that I decided that that was a must is that there be a kind of temporal uh, um, bookend. And what I mean by that is that I captured the breadth of the generations. So the youngest men that I interviewed were around 19, 20-year-olds, and the oldest at the time was 93. And so, you have, close to a 70-year uh, gap between the youngest and the oldest men, and a lot happens in that time and space. And so I knew that I definitely had to have representation from that swath of generations. So that was the first thing. The next thing I did was I looked for, what are the themes among those generations? What are the themes that keep coming up over and over again? And I think part of that uh, had to do with the context of the South. So, for instance, one of the things that was in everybody's narrative was religion, whether it was about their struggle with it, their disavowal of it, their wrestling with it, whatever, from Countess Vivian, who was raised Catholic, in the 20s and 30s, to, Stephen, who's one of the youngest people I interviewed, really struggling with this. But religion was, a constant thing. One of the things that didn't make the book so much, that I think could have been another running theme, was politics. And again, this has to do with the time in which I was conducting these narratives. So I started conducting them in 2004, right around the second Bush term. So one of the more prescient discussions going on that time, interestingly enough, was gay marriage. Also, a kind of swing to the right of Black churches as well, because the Bush administration was, collaborating with Black churches to incentivize them to support some of their policies in exchange for support from the administration. So it was an interesting moment to be interviewing these men about their experiences in the South. And with regard to that latter um, topic, these are men who, some of whom, uh, prior to the Bush administration, had felt at, at a base level tacit acceptance in their church. At least they weren't being harassed, or there wasn't a kind of uh, vehement disavowal of gay people from the pulpit, and all of that changed. So they felt, that they were being, thrown out of the communities that they'd grown up in. On the other hand, many of them weren't on board with gay marriage as a priority for Black gay folk. They were thinking more about housing discrimination and employment discrimination, and many of them weren't, as uh, you know, interested in marriage per se as a goal. So it was an interesting time, but I couldn't and it was all over the place in terms of people's perspectives around that. And so some of that, it pops in throughout some of the narratives, but it didn't come together as a chapter, for instance. um, but the chapters that are in the book emerged again across the generations, uh, and where there were a lot of a preponderance of stories about those particular things. So religion, coming out stories, love stories, um, folks who um, were gender nonconforming, or who sort of colored outside the lines in terms of their commitment to an identity per se. And then for the last chapter, I wanted to explicitly note the differences across the generation. So I give the full narratives of the youngest men I interviewed and the oldest, just to give a perspective on what happens between 1912, when Countess Vivian was born, and 1982, when Stephen is born, which I think is really interesting. So those were the things that sort of guided how I pulled the book together. And then even after that, I still ended up with 1,000 pages that I had to narrow down. And so at that point, it becomes, how many coming out stories do you need to include where it's the same story over and over again? Uh, so then at that point, you look for a twist on the coming out story, or so you have a representative number, and then you look for um, those stories that sort of uh, exist outside the norm, but you don't include all of them.
Now, I remember when you were working on editing that manuscript and how long it took, and you were very purposeful, I think, in carving out time and space away from the university to just do it. And I remember you would set up scenarios where you wouldn't leave a space, whether it's Australia or North Carolina, until you got to the next iteration. And it was impressive to see how kind of methodically and exhaustively you work through that material, and the book shows it. And I think if folks haven't seen the book, if you watch the film, which hopefully the folks who see this have done, one of the things I think it does hopefully is direct you back to that manuscript, because clearly we can't get to 600 pages.
No.
But there's so much in there, and I guess so I promise we'll get to the point where we're making the film, but I do feel like the backstory of the film is so important, because that is part of, I think, what makes it a special document. And I think it's some of that history and the expertise went into the earlier versions of the stories we tell. That's the reason why it's resonating so much with audiences when it's on the film festival circuit. And so what I don't remember, and I probably should, is whether or not you knew by the time you had delivered the book to the publisher that you were going to do a version of it on stage. Like, when did you make that decision, and what propelled you to say, okay, I spent all this time on this written text, now I'm going to like raise the level of complexity all the more by trying to take these stories and bring them to people using my own performative skills? Like, when did you know you wanted to do that, and why did you want to do that? What did you think, what did you imagine it would allow you to do and say and represent as a scholar that the book wasn't able to? And of course, I ask this at least in part because one of the things we've been really invested in at Penn for a long time is getting students to think about ways to incorporate different kinds of methods, different kinds of modes, different technologies into their scholarship. So we do a lot in film, we do a lot in audio. We've been trying to expand that to things like dance and performance, with the argument being that this isn't simply, there's nothing wrong with public scholarship and public intellectualism, but our project isn't just that. It isn't just reaching larger audiences. It's about redefining what counts as intellectual activity even within the academy, and saying the kind of sort of thought process you had that said, well, let me take this book, which is currency that's recognizable in the academy, right? It's the kind of thing that gets me tenure, gets me promotion. And I'm going to turn the screw one more rotation, and I'm going to take it to the stage. I know, I'm sure I can't imagine you thought you do it several different kinds of ways.
No.
but even the first time, like, what made you say, let me try this another way, and let me do it not necessarily simply because I want to reach folks outside of the academy? You did a lot of performing. I remember the first time you came to Penn.
That was in 2007.
2007, and you build it less as a performance than as I think it was like a kind of stage reading, right? But it was very performative. It was clear that at that point you realized that there was something that you were doing with the men's stories, with their words, that was actually resonating with audiences and moving them in ways that you built on subsequently. So, like, when did you have the idea to do that, and why do that as part of your scholarly activity and output?
Yeah, so in 2004, again, is when, between 2004 and 2006 is when I was collecting the narratives. It was in 2005 when I had the epiphany about the narratives existing in a form other than a book, because I met so many, and those of you who've seen the film, there's some personalities. So I met so many great storytellers and so many people who just had compelling ways of performing their stories, that I knew the page would not be able to, as much as I tried, even with me inserting the questions that I asked, or trying to give you a little flavor of their speech pattern, it would not take the place of the actual utterance, the performative element. And so then I was thinking, well, how can I bring those to life? Do I just give presentation where I just play a recorder of them speaking? And then I thought about my own training in performance studies and how we value performing the other as a way of getting to know the other. And I said, they need to be performed. And then the question was, do I perform them? Do I, write a script and have someone else perform and I direct it? And then it became a sort of intellectual and political question for me. Intellectual in the sense of what does it mean to take the words, the life histories of people out of the original context, stage it, but do it in such a way where you're actually playing with that tension between them being there and not there. And that was really fascinating to me to see what that might teach us all, teach me as a researcher, teach the viewing audience, and how that might reflect back on the men themselves. Political in the sense that, what are the ethics of doing that? You know, taking these stories, performing them without the men being there. And that all became very interesting to me. And so the way in which that those the first iteration of the performance emerged was, you know, my goal was not to have the audience suspend disbelief, and in the sense of having me disappear and become the men, but actually amplify that tension between them not being there and them being fully present. So how did I do that? I would uh, not move. I'd be on a stool, so I'm steady with the music stand that had the actual script of those words, but also have a audio component where the audience, before I say a word, you hear um, music that's sort of a theme about whatever they're about to talk about. So if it's about coming out, I play Donna Ross, I'm coming out, followed by an actual excerpt from the original interview. So you hear, before I speak, you hear the person speaking in his own voice from the original interview. And then I would give a sort of biographical sketch of that person, and then I would perform the narrative, giving you a sense of them, through vocal, a vocal sense of them, but again, not truly embodying them. Um, and for me, that was an interesting way to bring these stories to life, but also raise all kinds of methodological, ethical questions about what it means to um, interview people about their lives and represent it before others, and what kind of political work that could do in terms of advocacy, policy, because it's bringing attention to things that people may not otherwise know about, and reach a different audience than the book, which after all is published by University Press, which some people are, that's a non-starter from the beginning, but also reach communities outside the academy as well. So, what started out as, a thought experiment turned into a decade long um, journey of touring college campuses and communities, and over 150 performances of the stage reading. And we're not even talking about the play, but just the stage reading. And today, I enjoy that version the most because it's so simple, and you can attend to the stories and to the dynamic going on between me and the person I'm interviewing in a way that you can't, even with the film. It really forces you to sort of home in rather, uh, to some of the granular details. And I also learn something every time. Over 100 times I've performed these stories, but I learned something new each time I performed that version. So that was the why and the how of that version.
No, that's good. And it wasn't too long after that that you then decided you were going to really take this to the next level. You met Jane Sachs, who helped to produce the versions of the play, and there were 5 different versions, right? When it was all said and
I
done.
can't even count. So yeah, there was the Chicago version, there was the Austin, Texas version, there was the DC version, there was the uh, North Carolina version. Uh, I think the North Carolina version was the last version. Yeah, so four versions.
And I do think one of the cool things, there's so many, I think, nice elements in the film. But one of the cool things about the film is we get a chance to see some of these staged performances and juxtapose those to the ways you perform the pieces in the actual film in front of the men in their homes and other spaces. And so I saw the first version of the kind of big production in Chicago and knew immediately that I wanted to badger you into making a film version, partly again, because I thought it'd be wonderful to document your process. And I knew you did so much on that stage. I was interested in seeing if it would change at all to add elements like connecting you with the men that we do in the film, to have you perform it actually in situ where the men are talking about their lives, where they've lived their lives and had the experiences that they represent, which we're able to do in the film. The one thing I'll also say that I think is interesting is clearly you have a history as a performer, went through performance studies. By the time you decide to do this, and this is a, even when you're touring with the stage reading, this is quite an investment in time, in energy, in effort. At this point, you have tenure, right? So there were previous book publication that had happened, right? And I bring that up partly because some of what we're trying to do is figure out a way to make it more acceptable for junior scholars who don't already have the tenure hurdle cleared to say, this is what I do as a scholar, and this should count when I'm going up for promotion. I remember when Deb and I took this film that we did, Bad Friday, on the film festival circuit a while ago. And we had a great time, it was fun. And I remember meeting this one filmmaker from, and I'll keep her anonymous, but she was from a school out on the West. She was an academic and a filmmaker, and she had made an amazing documentary film. And I remember after watching it, telling her how tremendously moving I thought it was, and well researched and well told. She started to tell me about how much work she put into it, how she devoted the time and effort to get it done as a junior faculty member, and that her colleagues had told her if only she had put that time into writing a book instead of making the film, it would count. And I remember just feeling devastated for her, but also recognizing the kind of weird irony in that, right? Because what she had to do to make that film possible, what you had to do to take things from the page to the stage, entails, in a sense, all the stuff that we expect to see in the written version, plus more, right? And so there's this weird way in which she's penalized for having this incredible film because she didn't do the book first, and because the film isn't recognized, it's not intelligible in the same way in the academy, right? Partly, I guess, because we think we're making films not for other scholars, but for other audiences. And we're not supposed to write for other audiences, at least not as junior people, right? Not until you're senior. And so I think there's a version of that you were able to just shrug off because you had gotten tenure. Yep. And you were willing to say, you know what, I'm going to commit. And it was quite a commitment. I mean, by the show I saw in Chicago was spectacular. And I know it took a ton, I know each version took so much rehearsal. I mean, the performances, I mean, what was the longest run you had for one of the shows?
Oh my God. So, I mean, it was so intense. So the Chicago run actually was 6 shows a week for 5 weeks. The DC run was 8 shows a week for 6 weeks. Can you imagine?
No, I could not. How do you?
It's a solo show, and that I was doing 13 different characters, 8 shows a week. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, one show. Tuesday through Friday, one show. But on Saturday and Sunday doing two shows, a matinee and an evening performance. On Sunday nights, I was like voiceless, like had no voice. And I just had one day off, that Monday. And, it really made me appreciate, actors who do this, years on end on Broadway and, and even in local theaters. It's intense work. And it's interesting that you brought up the notion, the topic of I could do this because I was past tenure. A funny story about that. Sweet Tea was my promotion book. And so I started freaking out right before I submitted it to the press that it wasn't academic enough because, it wasn't uh, a traditional second monograph. And it was my editor at the time who said, E. Patrick, who's publishing your book? I said, University of North Carolina Press. She's like, that's enough. Like she had to talk me off the ledge, but that's how much we've internalized our own, disciplinary, uh, uh, I mean, protocols or metrics for what's valuable, what counts as real scholarship. And, there's always been an anti-theatrical bias in the academy. But as we've come to experience other um, humanistic, artistic forms of scholarship, it always sort of gets discounted, when it comes to evaluating it. And I think that's a shame because we can learn so much from these other forms in which, research manifests itself. But, we internalize it. And we also impose those standards on our students, on our junior colleagues. And so I'm hoping, that the work that we've been doing with this film and with other things that we can crack open that, but also remind ourselves as well. Because again, we're trained in disciplines and there are standards and so on and so. So, my thought process when I came to Northwestern was that I had to put my artistic self to the side until I got tenure because no matter what, I had to write a book. And that was the thing that was going to get me tenure. It wasn't going to be a play. It wasn't going to be a film. It was going to be a book. And that is still, the mindset of the academy.
Oh, you're right. And I do think there's a version of what we've been trying to do, both sort of you and I working through this film, thinking about hopefully another film linked to the projects you've done since Sweet Tea, that really is about normalizing the idea of this kind of approach being something that deans and department chairs and provosts and presidents should comprehend as valuable contributions to the academy, and giving them kind of guideposts for how to make sense of that, because often they're not going to be folks who come out of these traditions and these methodological approaches too,
And now that's just a quick thing. And now in the midst of COVID, we're going to be forced to think differently about those metrics moving forward because, people are going to be losing 2-3 years of research, of traditional research, I should say, but they're going to become innovative. And so we need to think, what does that innovation look like and how do we make it count in this context?
Great point. And I do think there's a version of, hopefully on the other side of the pandemic, what we've been able to gain, the kind of silver lining in what's been otherwise a very traumatic and difficult time, that actually should be a way to make this place, the academy, potentially more inclusive, more open to different kinds of scholarship from different sorts of folks who might not have felt recognized in the academy beforehand, or whose approaches to thinking about how to do the work they want to do felt too foreign from these conventional, traditional modality. So I'm hoping that maybe that's one possible thing we can help to bring to fruition. I think the other interesting part of the story as we go from the book through these stage versions to the film is the place of your story in the story, right? So I think when you look, you're not one of the characters really in the book version or
Right.
in the first version of the stage play. But to maybe talk a little bit more about that question of what it meant and why you felt like it was necessary to include your own story as a Black gay man from the South. And was it obvious? You're like, oh, I should have done that before, or did it take some work? And I say that also because I know once you and I and Nora Gross, who was the PhD student who really helped us to finally get this thing over the finish line, and Stephen began to think about what structure the film should take. One of the biggest questions was, how do you get situated in it, right? What part of the story is your story? And we ended up, I think, deciding, you're going to be central. You have to be central to the story in the way that you're not to the book, and that you weren't in the beginning of your attempt to translate the book to the stage. So tell me a little bit about how you think about this question of reflexivity in the project and how it's changed over time too. Because in the film, when folks watch the film, they know your story. They know your
Yeah.
story in a very personal way that they won't get from the book in the
Right.
same
Right.
way.
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So as you know, it's forced self-reflexivity. It wasn't voluntary. Because my impulse, as an ethnographer was actually, on the one hand, not to make myself invisible, but also not to prioritize self. So I didn't want these sort of accusations of navel gazing. And that's a tricky tightrope to walk many times, because you want to make sure that it's not like the Oz, the all omnipotent person. There is somebody behind the curtain. On the other hand, it shouldn't be so much about you that your interlocutors is just a footnote. But regarding the and I think that's probably why today I like the stage reading version, because it's me performing, but my story is not there. But for the play, um, Jane Sachs and all the other collaborators were very clear that what was interesting about this project was my relationships with these men and how they had evolved over the years, because they were always, wherever I was, there was usually one or two in the audience, for instance. They would be a part of the talkbacks. And again, that's also a methodological or maybe even a disciplinary difference between ethnography and oral history traditionally, in that traditional oral histories, it really is a one-off. There's not necessarily a continued relationship. Whereas with this project, to this day, I'm, almost weekly in contact with somebody from the project. I'm just thinking last week I had a long conversation with Duncan Teague, who's in the film, featured in the film. So everyone felt that it was my relationship with these men and how those relationships evolved that was interesting. And also, what role does my own identity play in this broader context of these other narratives about being Black and gay in the South, given that I am Black and gay from the South? And I went kicking and screaming in the other direction about that, because I just didn't want it to be about me. But I also didn't want to rehearse publicly my own sort of reckoning with my past. And that was the very thing that I had asked of these men, and the very thing that I was performing 150 times, their stories about their reckoning, but not taking into account my own, which had a lot to do with my own resentment against my community, not recognizing me, recognizing my queerness, or not acknowledging my queerness, but celebrating my accomplishments. Uh, my own the evolution of my relationship with my mother around my sexuality and my family. So I didn't want to do that. And I certainly didn't want to do that on a stage. um, but I had to, and it gave me a different perspective of the about the, I don't know, the magnitude of what I had asked of these men, to turn the recorder on myself and say, "You, E. Patrick, what about you? What's your tea? You need to spill it." And so the stakes changed for me in that regard. And then I think with the film, um, you all took it to the next level, because you weren't imagining, you didn't, it wasn't about me telling you about my life. We went to Hickory. We went to the place where I was born, like the physical, that one bedroom place where I was born, that community, my mother's apartment. Um, and so that was confronting for me. A lot of those scenes sort of are unfolding in real time. You don't know what's going to happen. Some of it's serendipity. Of course, we plan to shoot some things, but you don't know what's going to happen. Just like that scene with Charles, we didn't know what was going to happen in that moment. And that ended up being sort of the dramatic arc of the film. And I think his relationship with me, and our two different trajectories being from the same place, is really fascinating. Could have been, and we thought about it, could be a film of its own. So I think ultimately the decision to have my story in was an important one and was a crucial one. I still probably would have had to been convinced. Uh, but I absolutely think it was an important decision to make. And I appreciate you all forcing me to do it.
And I get your points about how it can feel like navel gazing, very solipsistic, get in the way of the story. But I do think in a whole bunch of ways, this just you being willing to be as vulnerable in the telling of your story in the film as the men are is part of what makes it so memorable. I think, I know we'll probably wrap up pretty soon, but this is a weird time to be on the film festival circuit, right? Because most of the festivals are either closed or all virtual. And I do feel like we've been so fortunate to get such positive responses from the festivals that show the film. And I think it's, the men are incredible storytellers. They do a great job narrating their own lives, analyzing how their lives bump up against larger issues, and they do that masterfully. But I think it's also the fact that you're willing to put your story in front of the camera as well, that kind of gives us the through line for the film and gives the audience a faith, I think, in you as our guide and as our central narrator, which really makes it a film that's, I think hard to forget. It's a small film, I feel like, but it speaks with a loud voice about these men and their lives. And I was really just proud to be a part of it. And I'm glad we convinced you, not just to add your story, but to do it at all.
I have a question for you, as as the conceiver of the film and co-director. There were moments along the way when we were working on the film. We were in post-production, and you consistently talked about, we need moments for the film to breathe. And I think one of the things that we were a little disheartened by early on is when some of the film festivals passed on us. I mean, we're all the better now, now that we're 7 or 8 awards in. But it is a slow film. It takes its time, and again, we milk that tea metaphor, for all it's worth. But I would be interested to hear you talk about what your investment was in that whole notion of breath, uh, letting it breathe, letting it sort of simmer and do the work that it needs to do. That's one question. The other was, it was your idea to have me perform in front of the men, and that seems to be the thing also that people remember the most, watching them watch me reflect their lives back to them. So talk a little bit about that.
Great, great questions. I mean, I think for me, I always um, remember the films that actually don't pretend to be just kind of windows into a world without a film, right? So I think there are two kinds of filmmakers. One filmmaker almost wants to place the audience in the movie and take away all the filmmaking apparatus and just put them in the world in an immersive way that is about trying to get them to forget they're watching a film. And I think that can often be very powerful. But I find, as someone interested in the affordances specifically of film and how to think in images and sound, I'm equally as intrigued by the films that draw attention to their manufactured constructedness as films. And so for me, when I said I wanted the film to have a chance to breathe, I think part of what I wanted us to try to do, and I think we accomplished it, at least as far as I'm concerned, is to use the camera as a way to really allow what we know are going to be big moments and small moments, very obvious, self-evident revelations, and maybe quieter, more subtle, almost incantations of the truth. Let the film camera allow us to have the option of capturing any of those different kinds of ways of telling the story. And so for me, it meant trying to play with, what is our approach to, I remember we had some interesting like dolly scene shots. I remember when we shot in DC, we said, well, what would it look like to make this incredibly stylized? And for me, the breathing metaphor was more about saying, like, I want to make sure this is a film that it's going to try to do a lot of different things. I always tell people it's deceptive in that it seems very straightforward, almost simple in its storytelling, but we're doing so much in it. And I think the reason why we're able to pull it off is because we pace it in a way that allows the audience to be able to recognize the moments that are small and to sit in them for a while, and to appreciate almost the profundity of what the men are saying or what they've experienced, but also to be able to get up and move when it's time to move. And I think it's this kind of the changing cadences of the film and pacing of the film that's about getting the audience to really understand in a fulsome way what the film camera can do. And so the idea of, to go to the second question, the idea of shooting, that was always what I thought was going to be really intriguing, because you do such a great job on that stage. But what happens when we take you and have you perform it in front of the men, maybe even in the space that's referenced? So I think part of what makes Charles's scene so powerful is we have everything right there in that moment. And we're literally in that space, which is, I think, part of why he's so moved by it, given all the different things he's been grappling with and different ways of understanding his own identity over time. And so for me, I did feel like if there's anything the film camera could add, because the stage performances were so riveting, and it's the same stories, but what we can do is we can take it, rip it off the stage and put it back in the world in an interesting way, and show not just what it means for the men to see you perform them in places that they know, in spaces that are their spaces, right? Often in ways that allow them to critique you directly after you perform it, which we try to show in the film. But also, I think it was this attempt to say, like, let's use this as an opportunity to really give people a version of the story that wouldn't be reproducible necessarily on stage, and that clearly takes us, I think, very far afield in some way from the powerful core of the narratives that you caught in the book. And I hope if people, when they watch the film, they get a sense of why it was so important for us to allow you to perform these and again, the thing is, what they don't get in the film is they don't get the full performances, right? So we give them a spattering, but I think it's enough for them to recognize that the story of the film is still in some ways, I think, fleshed out, because we're getting these other pieces that you weren't able to give the audiences from the stage. And so, I want to feel like all of that works in ways that is going to allow the film to continue to be useful, probably in a classroom and beyond, and to resonate with audiences who see multiple stories, not a kind of monolithic singular telling of what it means to be Black and gay and male and from the South, but all these kind of nuances and shades of it, right? All these different sort of flavors of the tea, right? That we play up in the film. And I think the film does a good version of that. And I think you're guiding us through it, and you're being willing to be vulnerable enough to show us your relationship with your mother. There's so many things in the film. We always talk about the high school reunion scene, which we weren't even able to get in the film, which is so powerful, because it's grown people like you now reflecting back on what they thought about themselves and you and race and class back then when you all were in high school. So powerful. I still think we need to do something with that. I mean, put it online or something, because that was another one of these moments when you realize, I thought, like, it was worth doing this. This isn't simply a kind of poor extension of a really powerful stage show. It's a wonderful revision, a powerful in its own right, I think, revision of what was a riveting stage show. And I think that for me is what I'm most proud of, because there's something about what you were able to do in the in the North Carolina version that was like lightning in a bottle. And I think in a weird kind of way, we were able to pull that off serendipitously, and because we had a decision that we were going to work over a long period of time to try to get the story right. That really pays off. And so for me, that's the version of breathing is really about saying, let's trust the audience to be able to handle something that's going to come at them from a lot of different angles, give them a lot of different ways in and out of the story. And I think we did it.
Yeah, I think we did too. And I think in the same way that the story slowly unfolds, this film has slowly been like generating buzz. It's been a slow burner from those first rejections. We won't name the names.
I don't even remember them at this point.
I don't either. I don't know her. To now where we are actually engaged with a distributor. Hopefully we can seal a deal, and more importantly that people will have access to teach it, because there's been a lot of inquiry. So great. Well, thanks for engaging in this conversation. It feel like we've been doing this for a long time, but this conversation felt like the first time in some way.
No. The first time definitely like this. So I'm glad we did it. And you should at least tell them, maybe the next version of this project just got released, right? So we should maybe end with you.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. So Sweet Tea, the play script, actually was just released by Northwestern University Press. So it'll be really, we've talked about this film being meta. How meta is it going to be watching someone watching someone play me playing other people? Yeah, that's going to be wild. But yeah, so Sweet Tea, the play.
No, that's exciting. I can't wait I haven't gotten it yet, so I can't wait to get it.
Oh,
no.
Make sure you get it.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And of course, we have to get ready for the next project, but we'll figure that out, because we're trying to make sure that this work gets out there and circulates. And, we're in a position where we can try our best to make sure that happens.
So thanks everybody for tuning in, and hope you enjoyed the film.
Absolutely.